Saving starts with internet and wireless from Xfinity. Because when you get Xfinity Internet and add mobile, you can save up to $400 a year on wireless. Enjoy fast, reliable internet at home and nationwide 5G on the go, included at no extra cost. Get Xfinity Internet and mobile together and ask how to get an eligible 5G phone on us. And for a limited time, $300 back. Don't miss out. Go to Xfinity.com/start saving. Call 1-800-XFINITY or visit a store today. Restrictions apply. Savings based on optimized pricing. Actual savings may vary.
All right, hour number 2 here, the Nick Handley Show alongside Go Big Ready. Appreciate you making us part of your afternoon. Going to be talking Huskers opening fall camp on Friday with Brian Christopherson, Husker 24/7 Sports. He'll be joining us and your phone calls on the Limitless Mail Medical Hotline at 402-573-0590. The DJ's Dugout Inbox open for you on Twitter at NickESPN590. And I want to go to the DJ's Dugout Inbox. Jeff asked the question or gives his 2 cents. Says Texas and OU should stay Big 12 or switch to the Pac-12. They are not SEC teams and will not be as successful as they think they will be. And this also coincides with a tweet I saw from Ben Stevens, and there was a comment that I kind of chuckled at. And Ben Stevens, who we'll be talking to later on today, host of the Locked On Big Ten podcast, had a little gif of a kid on a playground just swinging while there's like a blazing fire a block away. And he says, Nebraska watching the Big 12 burn to the ground. And then a member of the Barstool Sports team, Kelly, in Vegas, says, yeah, because they've been so dominant since leaving. What Jeff and what Kelly in Vegas need to realize when it comes to these moves, folks, get caught up in the competitive side of things all you want. Whether you are a mediocre program in the highest revenue part of the conference, like the revenue sports, like football, or you're elite, you're still getting a huge TV revenue share. So first, to Jeff's point, if they're not as competitive or successful as they were in the Big 12, for a moment, whenever this new TV deal comes out for the SEC with the addition of OU and Texas, it will be massive. And as a university, yeah, there's part of that decision being made geared towards athletics, and a big part. And a big part of the athletic decision is through football because it is your biggest revenue sport for Oklahoma and Texas and a lot of SEC schools. But you're not always, and this is what I learned when hearing the different stories when it came to Nebraska going from the Big 12 to the Big 10 and hearing about other conference realignment back then. The whole discussion about, well, can we hang with these teams? Can we be a conference champion year in and year out? Basically, where we stand in our conference now, can we duplicate that in the other conference? Well, 2 things are at play there. A, you're always going to say, I'm sure we can adjust at some point. B, it's not as talked about as you think. It's not the biggest priority. The biggest priority to get, because remember, you as an athletic director, you might have all the aspirations in the world of leaving your current conference because you feel like you're an odd fit or things are unstable, whatever the case may be. But you got to get your presidents and chancellors to go along with that. And for them to go along with it, they want to know more than anything about what type of money would you get from that conference compared to the other. And so Kelly in Vegas of Barstool Sports can bring up Nebraska's lack of dominance in the Big Ten, and she's not wrong at all. But do you think Nebraska as a university cares as much about that right now compared to what they're making hand over fist when it comes to cash? Hell no.
No. Kelly in Vegas, she's pretty new too to Barstool. So, but
Well, that's fine. I don't even know who she is, but I'm just saying that type of take and what Jeff is saying about Texas and Oklahoma going to the SEC. Well, can they be as competitive? They're sorely mistaken. And then he responds by saying, "What good is money if you are not winning consistently?" Well, it still spends, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
You still have the money. You can create facilities. You can do other things to help you compete with the big boys. You have endless resources when you up the money. There's not going to be anything in that new TV contract saying, well, but you have to win at least 8 or 9 games a year. No, sorry. You're still getting that television revenue share. So people can laugh all they want about Oklahoma and Texas maybe not having the same type of success in the Big 12 as they are having the same type of success in the SEC as they will in the Big 12. But guess what? They're going to make a lot more money, just like you can laugh at Nebraska right now for making the move from the Big 12 to the Big 10 and say, well, gosh, that worked out well for them. Well, actually, it has. Financially, it has worked out well for them. People forget about that.
Yeah, people forget that right now what we're talking about, it's not about wins or losses. It's not about how many championships you got. They're chasing dollar signs right now.
Right.
And I mean, we took a lot of our dollar signs. A&M took a lot of the dollar signs. Mizzou and Colorado did. So Oklahoma and Texas had to go find them somewhere else because they weren't getting them with TCU and West Virginia.
And that's the other thing about the next part of this potential Big Ten expansion talking. And I'm glad Brad Edwards brought that up as far as what teams can you bring into your conference that will allow you to renegotiate the TV deal that you're not only making this same type of money that you were making before, but you're making more that it's worth it. That for all the other Big Ten members to say, yep, we are in agreement with this, you want to see more revenue coming in. And just adding teams for the sake of adding teams from a financial standpoint isn't always going to make the most sense. Now, from a competitive standpoint, sure, I'd love to see the Big Ten expand. And there are some really interesting ideas that, as you typically have when stuff like this goes down. Like, okay, how about this? Try this one on. How about if we do this? What about this? And they're all kind of exciting because you're like, oh, man, you could have sort of a reunion of old Big 12 teams and they would still be under the Big Ten umbrella. And instead of divisions, you could have these pods. And we'll entertain all of that. But, folks, you got to remember, when these decisions are made, when conference expansion takes place, it has very little, none at all, but very little to do with, boy, I don't know, that's a bear of a conference. I don't know if we can succeed. If you are also being told from that conference that our next TV deal with you guys in it, and we've already talked to them, it's going to be huge. You're going to be able, first of all, in the SEC current TV deal, it's more than what they make in the Big 12. But when they renegotiate, that thing's going to be a monster. It will be. And there's going to be all kinds of different possibilities with the streaming services as well that you are not thinking or even worried about. Like if you're the chancellor and a president that has to sign off on this, give you the ultimate consent for this and approval, you're not worried about it. Well, you may not be in the college football playoff as much, and the college football is expanded anyway. But you're not really, that's not keeping you up at night. You're thinking more of the bottom line. Give me a figure. What will we be guaranteed minimum to pull in by joining this conference, and what the TV money will give to us? And if it's a big number, you're not worried about the result on the field. You're just not.
Yeah, you could tell athletic directors or chancellors weren't mad or angry, or even people in the SEC who run the SEC weren't angry because A&M was grumpy. They were mad, and they didn't care about A&M's feelings. They know what Texas and Oklahoma can bring compared to the Aggies.
Absolutely.
They're like, no, this is all about dollar signs, buddy.
And that's why Notre Dame, Brad's right. There are only a couple of teams from that standpoint for the Big Ten that you should really go after. Now, if you have your TV partner saying, hey, you know what, if you guys add Kansas in Iowa State, we think we can get to a much bigger revenue share. We think we can get to a pretty good spot. Okay, you're listening to that. I'm not saying you're not. But if you're talking about brands that make a lot of sense, and Kansas is interesting because when you think of the football part of it, Iowa State makes a lot more sense from a competitive standpoint. But guess what? The conference is probably not thinking about that as much as they are, Kansas, even though they suck at football. And they're a basketball school. They would definitely up our basketball profile. That's a Kansas City market. That's a major Midwestern market that we currently do not have a presence in. So you're thinking more of the Kansas City media market than what Kansas's football team looks like. Again, that's a dollar conversation, not will they be able to win many games? I mean, Rutgers, case in point. Folks, the Big Ten did not say we need Rutgers because, good Lord, they are so good in every sport. They are going to maximize our conference profile as one of the most competitive conferences out there. No, they get the New York market. They get the New York media market. It's a huge, huge market, which, again, going back to the TV contract. Oh, you guys are going to be in the New York market too? Well, now we're talking. You got to get out of that. Well, how competitive are they going to be? That doesn't matter when making these decisions. It doesn't. But you can also make really kind of weird decisions when you just add somebody for the sake of adding them because the other conference is. That's why the Big Ten's got to be very careful with what it does. If it comes down to, you can't get Notre Dame or you can't get something that's just going to make a lot of sense, both from a financial standpoint or from a competitive standpoint, do you really need to expand right now?
I think they do, just because, like you said, that you got to keep up with the Joneses.
And see, I felt that way on Friday, but after kind of reading everything here too, it's almost like doing something for the sake of doing it where if it doesn't make sense, why are you doing it? Unless everybody else around you is doing it. And right now it's just the SEC.
Yeah. Well, if it doesn't make sense, like as much as Iowa State and Kansas sound so awesome, it doesn't, because college basketball and Iowa State's brand in football, it doesn't move the needle. Like you said, you got to get a Notre Dame or even USC, as dumb as that sounds, if they're all the way in Southern California.
Can you imagine them playing Rutgers, having a bike
right.
flight? Like, oh, right, sweet.
Or
we've got each side of the country covered.
Or like Rutgers fans or like an 11 a.m. game at USC, that's like 9 o'clock, right? Yeah. The big noon kickoff.
No home games at the Coliseum anytime before 2. Can't do that. Gotta have that. I don't know. It's an interesting conversation. We're going to talk more Nebraska fall camp as that gets underway on Friday, but we'll get into this because there's another conference that we have not talked about that looks like they could come out of this entire thing if the Big 12 is indeed sort of dismantled. They could come out of this thing looking very strong. And we'll talk about that. But coming up next, Brian Christopherson of Husker 24/7 Sports joins me next. So don't look now, but we are less than a week from Nebraska fall camp officially getting underway, and all the festivities will start on Thursday with Fan Day, and then Friday the first practice leading up to that season opener out in Champaign, Illinois. On August 28th is Nebraska in what is going to be a very interesting 2021 season and a very important one for this coaching staff as we are joined on the Limitless Male Medical Hotline, Brian Christopherson of Husker 24/7 Sports. So, Brian, you got your Big Ten Media Day fix in. You got a chance to hear from Nebraska, other Big Ten schools. Before we get into the season and practice starting on Friday, it just seemed like business as usual, but it was pretty well embraced, right?
Yeah. I think there was probably a lot of repetitive stuff with football. But Trev Alberts, I think, sort of swooped in and stole the show. Just seeing it, the kind of the candor that he has when he's asked questions, he doesn't really back away from things and stating, it hasn't been what it needs to be. And, sort of the relationship they've got to work out with the Big Ten and guys like Kevin Warren and stuff like that. So I thought Trev Alberts in like the 13-minute session that he had with us off to the side was dynamite. And I know people hear that all the time, like, oh, this guy won the press conference or whatever. But people can go watch the videos out there for themselves, and I think they'd say, yeah, that's a pretty good start. Now let's see what he can get done behind the scenes.
So if you were to kind of look at, and I was discussing this a lot at the end of last week during Big Ten Media Days, the overall tone for Nebraska, what did you kind of take away from that from Scott Frost to the student athletes?
He's confident. I really do think he likes his football team quite a bit, way more than people on the outside do. Of course, you'd sort of expect that and hope that, but I mean, it beats the alternative. I think he feels like they're confident, and now they just need something good to happen right off the bat, which of course brings us to that week 0 game. And just, I mean, what a monster right off the bat. You know, you get a Big Ten West game with most of the country watching because it's one of the first games of the season, so people are going to tune in. And, it's really Nebraska's chance to sort of set a tone, and then you get a couple home games and you build a little momentum and belief of, like, yeah, we can win, we can win with this group. And that is something, if you look at Nebraska's last few seasons, that has really eluded them. I mean, there was opportunities early in the year to get sort of a close win or a tough win against Colorado, and they lost a couple of those games. It's just, and then it's just sort of hard to get it back on track, and there's sort of negativity in the state that follows those games if you're not on the right end of it. So I like the fact that Nebraska players don't back down at all in just acknowledging, yeah, that's a huge game right off the bat. Yep. They're not downplaying it at all. It's like, that it is. We got to win that game. Deontay Williams said that's as big as any game this season, and that's the approach they should have.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I mentioned that was refreshing to see, because you can cliche that all you want to be like, it's as big as any other game, but they're not. And that kind of leads me to what we should expect starting as early as this Friday, even if they're in helmets and sweats, that they're getting after this thing. They're setting the tone, but it's going to have such a different feel because, Brian, never before have we ever really looked at a season opener. And we can go back to the times at Nebraska. I mean, the year that Frank Solich was told that he had to fire his assistants and bring in a new staff, and they open up against Oklahoma State. Look, Nebraska's open seasons with conference opponents before, but never can I remember that first game holds so much significance on what this season could look like and how important this season is for the future of this football program. And I feel like if you're not sort of running away from that, if you're looking at that on as early as Friday, that the intensity of this next month for Nebraska football, it might be as high as we've ever seen.
Yeah, I think so. And then there's that other interesting part of when that game starts, in the first few series, Husker fans are going to be getting used to certain skill players like that haven't played really ever or a lot, toting the football or catching the football. You're going to be looking at Samori Toure. Okay, what number is he? People are Oliver Martin. Okay, he's big. Who's the running back? Is it Gabe Ervin, Marquise Stepp, whoever it is? There's going to be like 5 or 6 guys in the first few series of this big game who they're new to sort of handling the football and having a key role for Nebraska. And so when you attach those two things together, it just carries massive intrigue. I do think it's going to be as intense as it's ever been over there this next month. And at the same time, I think within the state, there's sort of this laying low. It's not that people don't think they can maybe get off to a good start and get things done, but there's sort of let's wait and see vibe. And people don't want to fully attach themselves to it just yet. They want to see what that first result is before they get too emotionally invested in this particular team. So there's all those things sort of swirling in the wind that it is one of the, we would probably say this most years because we try to talk ourselves into it, but I actually do think this is one of the most interesting Husker seasons I've covered in the last 15 years doing the beat, just as far as going into it, what the heck's going to happen and how big is this towards setting the tone for not just this year, but for the seasons to come after it.
Right, 100%. And Brian, I would ask you this. because I know why I feel that way, and I'm curious if you would agree. You see enough on this roster that makes you think, if they get the breaks to go their way, if certain things happen, and I'm not talking about things unrealistic, I'm just talking about just some normal breaks, and they can clean up some things that are reasonable to ask them to clean up, there's a roster there that you could see some really good success. But what our eyes have told us over the last 3 years, or even 4 years if you count the last year, Mike Riley, our eyes tell us, no, man, it ain't happening. So you could easily see this thing going one of two ways, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of people want to see, give me a Nebraska team that's actually in the plus category on turnover margin, for a change. Let's see what that looks like. If they were plus in turnovers and they evened out field position through special teams and some of those things, as opposed to playing 5 or 6 yards behind their opponent every series, what does that look like on a given week and toward the record, and how much is that worth? And I think there's a thought like, well, it's worth quite a bit. It's worth maybe 2 or 3 wins. But then there's that other part that tugs at people where they say, yeah, but there's so much data established, not just from the Frost era, but previous eras, where it feels like those stats always go the other way.
Yeah.
And so I'm not willing to believe that's going to change just because you're telling me there's been a lot of hard work in the off season and all that. So the fans and all that have a very fair viewpoint on this of, yeah, I want to believe, but you got to make me believe, and you got to do it early on. And that Illinois game right off the bat, we can talk about the sellout streak and all this stuff. Think about what the mood is like in Lincoln if they play well in week 0, they come back with a win, and you've got a couple games to tune yourself up where you should win them, as opposed to if you do that thing where you turn it over 3 times and you lose to Illinois, and then you're playing Fordham, in Memorial Stadium the next week. It's just such a 180 it would be on each side of it, of what that mood would be like around here.
Brian, we did hear the student athlete, Scott Frost himself, speak about the offensive line a lot. In your opinion, is that more wishful thinking? They hope that this group can be that group that really emerges and steps forward, or do you think there is legitimate reason that will be one of the stronger position groups?
I think they've recruited the heck out of it on paper, and now that needs to show itself, in the games. And so there is reason to look down the names and be like, yeah, that looks pretty good. If Juergens gets his snaps in order and he can be a beast, we've seen his measurables and the stuff he does testing wise, he can be a freak. So people know that, and then they know Turner Corcoran's a guy who was one of the most highly recruited offensive linemen just a recruiting cycle ago, and Ben Hart sort of the same way one cycle before that. Piper's a young guy. You got one veteran really, and probably Sichterman maybe at your right guard, but basically you've got a group of about 4 to 5 guys who, if they could figure it out, and by October we're saying, man, they're playing pretty well up front. That's one of those things that's going to encourage and feed people and say, okay, I'm in on this, because these guys are going to be together for 2 or 3 years, and that's exciting. So they've got a chance to go out, and there should be some doubts about them because they haven't done it in a full season together. But I can also see where they could be really the position group, I think, that makes people believe in the big picture in Nebraska over the next few years, because if you're good in the trenches, you're oftentimes sitting pretty. And if Nebraska is looking good there this season, it means they could look good for the next 2 seasons after, because all those guys are pretty young on paper.
I know there was some roster news announced earlier today, and that is Branson Yeager is not on the roster. So there you have one guy that will not be a part of the season, offensive lineman, as we're talking offensive line. Brian, if you can kind of remind fans, he was a 2021 guy, but just did not really see a role right out of the gate. Didn't hear a lot about him last year either. What was kind of the backstory on Branson Yeager, as we remember?
He's a huge guy. He's 6'8", 330, and he came from Utah. And I interviewed him last in December because he was about to get to campus, as an early enrollee.
Mm-hmm.
And, he was optimistic and stuff like that. But I will say this, and I don't want to be unfair to Branson, but I walked away from that interview a little unsure how it was going to go, I'll be honest, because he said out loud to me, he's like, yeah, my strength isn't what it needs to be at this level. He told me that. And so, I mean, that's not uncommon for a guy coming out of high school, but he's like, It's going to take like 3 years. And that's also not uncommon that it takes a lineman about 3 years to be Big Ten ready, but you just don't often hear recruits say that publicly right off the bat. They kind of look at it as it'll take a year or so. And there was going to be sort of a culture adjustment that he was aware of. And so I don't know if that's all what contributed to it or not. I do know that once winter and spring stuff started, he just wasn't heard from. We didn't see him at all at spring practices, and then I just know he hasn't been around. So it was sort of inevitable that it was coming. The good news is Letofsky and Teddy Prohaska have been getting some pretty good early reviews. So hopefully they can be guys who kind of make that O-line class stand out.
Yeah, and the reason I bring this roster news up, as you just pointed out, he was not part of spring, so it was hard to really look at his presence in Nebraska and say, well, this guy's clearly going to factor in yet, because we just hadn't really seen any signs of that as of today.
Yeah, and I mean, even like Letofsky is a guy they really like. I mean, everybody does, not just coaches, but players were talking about him at media days, and I think Prohaska is the same way. But ideally, what Greg Austin wants is guys sort of build behind the scenes for a year or two, and then they're up, and you sort of that's the way it works. You sort of get this thing going where guys don't play. You don't need guys right off the bat when they're 18 years old and they're not ready to face off against the Big Ten opposing defensive linemen. But you build them up for a couple years, and you've got guys you can count on now. And then it's sort of a cycle ongoing like it used to be. That's what Greg Austin wants. That's what he thinks is building. And the good news is we're not talking about Henry Letofsky like he has to be like the sixth man in week 0. And there have been teams I've covered not that long ago where we might be saying that. Mm-hmm. So that on that surface is that's an improvement.
Brian Christopherson of Husker 24/7 Sports all gets underway on Friday with the first practice of fall camp with Fan Day on Thursday. Brian, appreciate it, man. Have a great rest of the week.
All right, thanks a lot.
All right, when we come back, the storylines that we're going to be most interested in the first week of Husker fall camp, and there is something that I love about Nebraska's first opponent as we get fall camp cranked up. We'll get into that next. There's one thing that I love about a team opening with a conference opponent right out of the gate. And that is exactly what we were just talking to Brian Christopherson about, is the fact that Nebraska, you heard Ben Stille, you heard Austin Allen, you heard Deontay Williams, all discuss this at Big Ten Media Days about that game. Scott Frost talked about it. They're not shying away from the significance and the importance of that game, and not just because of what you used to hear Bo say. Well, it's the most important game because it's the next game.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, I mean that was the one thing we always heard from Bo, and you hear that from other coaches. Well, we don't want to sort of put too much on one game of our schedule. Whatever our next game is, that's the most important game. So what they kind of sort of laid out for us is what we've been talking about so many times. And that is how pivotal this game is and how this could be the difference between Nebraska getting off to a 3-0 start or a 2-1, 1-2. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Going into that Oklahoma game. And having back-to-back home games, if you're somebody that is really, really hoping Nebraska can keep the sellout streak, the home attendance at its peak, well, winning that Illinois game is going to go a long way in doing that. So the thing that I love and that I hope to hear about, even though I have said a lot over the last, 5-6 months, whatever the season ended. I don't want to hear any more about how great practices were. I don't want to hear any more about how this was the best practice in the history of all practices that ever involved a football. I don't want to hear any of that. But I wouldn't mind getting a glimpse of guys that are having some very intense practice sessions right out of the gate, which you would expect, but also as you kind of get into that lull of fall camp where you're sort of getting tired of all of the mundane details and the length of fall camp starts wearing on you a little bit, and it can you can have bad habits. You can develop bad habits because you're just not seeing necessarily the light at the end of the tunnel or the opponent at the end of the tunnel. And look, anybody who's even played high school football, when you get into fall camp and you're going through two-a-days, even though they don't do two-a-days, but you're going through all of those different sessions and you're like, gosh, the season still feels like it's a long ways out, and all this conditioning, all this work we're putting in, gosh, it's just time to play somebody already. And so you may not bring your very best one day. And, you not bringing your best, someone else might not bring their best. And all of a sudden, again, you kind of develop maybe some bad habits. And you got to sort of crank things back up. Now, if you've got a veteran-type team, you don't necessarily have to worry about that regardless of who you're playing out of the gate. But the thing that I like about this is they're really circling this game as an extremely important game to the overall success of the season. And they're not wrong for doing that. And I like that they're doing that because I feel like by putting that out there, there's going to be that accountability. That if somebody is sort of dragging one day or 1 week, that you don't need the coaches to rah-rah you. You're going to have your own players, your own peers that are going to feel that intensity, knowing that not only are you opening the season, sooner than what you might realize, but you're doing so against a conference opponent and a divisional opponent. And you're playing in the very first weekend of college football, where the majority of college football is still waiting another week, where there's going to be a lot of eyes on you. That, in my opinion, should really be able to push those guys through those more challenging days of fall camp. When, students are on campus, there's just not that buzz because that first week it should always be extremely lively. Okay, it might not be the prettiest thing, but guys should be going 1,000 miles an hour because they just cannot wait to get back out there, because now that the workouts, after every one of those, they're getting that much closer to the season and to a game. As, opposed to spring, where you're like, okay, we're getting closer to the big scrimmage. It doesn't motivate guys as much. You understand in the spring that what you're doing is important to your development, but you also know you're still a long ways away from the season. And for guys who maybe had not ever experienced the spring game or have and understand, it's cool for a couple hours, but it's not a game. Then you go through summer conditioning and you're not even in fall camp yet. Once you get to fall camp, that first week, you're so excited to be out there. You're bouncing around, and everybody is, again, the energy level is so high. But then you get to, week 2 or 3, after maybe the first week of pads, and you're ready, as you always hear the players, ready to hit somebody else, ready to play a game. And even when you're a couple of weeks from that, you're still wondering, like, oh, gosh, man, this just feels like forever. It feels like it's still so far out. Well, during those times, you can be like, I don't care. It's Illinois. Every day that we spend on the field and knowing how important that game is. I'm not trying to say, like, Illinois is this big target for Nebraska as far as rivalry or anything. We just know how important that game is, and they do too. And I feel like they're going to treat fall camp accordingly. It's one thing when you're playing, Southern Alabama, South Alabama. You're like, okay, cool. We're just excited to get the season started. Can't wait to get out there and hit somebody. But, does South Alabama, they don't reside in your conference. You already feel like, hey, you're gonna beat them. There's not, you don't know much about them. Illinois waxed Nebraska last year, embarrassed a lot of the guys that are currently on this roster. And you understand, these guys aren't dumb. As much as you say, hey, don't look ahead. Don't ever look ahead in the schedule. These guys aren't dumb. They understand that road game right out of the gate leads to 2 very winnable home games before the big date against Oklahoma. And that if they take everything starting, hopefully they already did back in the spring and summer, but everything starting this Friday, if they take that serious and they get the most out of practice every day leading up to that they're going to feel invincible going into that game. And they need that. That's why I love these conference games right out of the gate, because it's one thing if you're playing like a top 25 team, like say Nebraska was playing Florida. Yes, of course they're going to be juiced out of their minds to play that game, but they're also going to understand that, hey, if we lose to them, we still have all of our conference goals in front of us. Right out of the gate, a divisional opponent, like you can be either after week 1 before everybody else plays college football, I should say after week 0, you could already be in tops of the West Division. When's the last time we could say that about Nebraska? Right?
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
We win in a month. We're in first place.
Right there, going into week 1, you're already in first place in the West Division.
Oh my.
Come on.
We're going to go undefeated.
But you understand there's no room for error there because Illinois has already had your number before. So it's not like, yeah, we're playing Illinois, but man, we've kicked the crap out of them. No, they kicked the crap out of you a year ago. So they've got your attention. Like, this could not be a better scenario from a preparation standpoint for a game out of the gate for Nebraska, in my opinion.
It's a revenge game. It's a game to just measure Nebraska, because, I mean, yeah, they might have rolled us last year, but their coach also got fired, and they rolled us last year. So we better beat these dudes.
It's a winnable game against a team that embarrassed you, so you will definitely be paying attention to them.
Yeah.
There's no doubt at all that they will be taking this game so serious. And hopefully the practices, even though I don't need to hear every detail about practice, the practices should reflect that.
Yeah, and if I'm not going to get like an Oregon or an Oklahoma to open up the season, I'll take a divisional opponent instead of playing South Dakota State or Arkansas State. Like, it's going to be fun.
I love it. I absolutely love it. All right, we're back after this. So by now you have seen the swimming coaches of all swimming coaches from Australia. The clip that last night, I'm glad I watched this, well, as live as NBC will show it to you. But watching the Ariane Titmus versus Katie Ledecky. I mean, I know there's other swimmers in the pool, but in the 400, and I've always known Ledecky as like the best. And this Ariane Titmus, who's basically used Katie Ledecky's dominance in that event to pretty much make her the swimmer she was. She ended up winning the gold over Ledecky, and it was actually a lot closer than what people thought. They thought Titmus would do a lot better than, or at least, win by a bigger margin. And it was close. It was exciting. But the real story of this was the Australian swimmer coach who just went berserko after the win. And I was watching like their little story leading up to the race. And this guy is just like as intense as there is. I mean, he was just, you could tell. Like, I think that the last clip, he said something like, she's got some stuff, but does she have, the stuff to, bring it home? We'll find out. But Dean Boxall's celebration after his swimmer won was as priceless as it gets when he sort of like starts pelvic thrusting the guardrail of where he was watching, like kind of in the rafters where they have all the coaches, and just, rips his mask off, which I'm sure just made the IOC extremely nervous. Like, oh God, we got to test this guy now.
These dang Australians.
Yeah. He just starts pelvic thrusting the guardrail, and I don't know if you noticed, at the end, there's this poor young girl. I couldn't tell you how old she was because she has a mask on. I'm sure she's, one of the volunteers trying to keep everybody within their section. and their designated area because, I mean, it's very tight restrictions there with COVID. And, like, he almost sort of, like, goes beyond the boundary. And, I mean, she couldn't be taller than, like, 5'1". And you got this guy that's going berserko, just like he's, like, air humping the rail and, like, anybody who's in sight. And she's like, oh, please just stay here. Like, I lost it trying to watch that girl, like, contain him. It was the best part of that.